My topic for the day is slightly different. Most of these speakers actually covered, what their organizations are doing, but I'll be talking more about what we, as a consortium of companies, together doing in terms of knowledge sharing or bringing best practices, etc. So my topic today would be the PCF, TFS, the TFS PCF guidelines, which are specifically created for the chemical industry. I personally work with Merck, which is a German pharma company, predominantly around 350 years old company with diverse interest into chemicals, electronics, healthcare, and life science, of course. But here I will be representing TFS, being one of the founding member of the TFS. So this is a brief agenda. So we will talk about what TFS is, what are its global work streams, setting the stage around what is this PCF guidelines, why do we need them basically, and then, of course, a little bit future outlook. As I said, TFS is a consortium of about 37 European chemical majors. Dr. Erika, she's here. I think she's also, her company is also one of the founding members of TFS. And their main agenda is basically focused on how they can collaborate together, bring in more transparency into the supply chains for themselves, for the member companies, and also for the suppliers, and how that information can be kind of shared together, rather than, kind of reinventing the wheel again and again. And as Sheres mentioned earlier, at the beginning, he said, what people in, let's say, in the Western world, in Europe or in the US do, and most of the Indian companies here, they being kind of, suppliers for them, whatever regulations come in force there, they, in a way, kind of become mandatory on all of you. So if you comply with them, you're going to be more successful by default, and if you don't, then naturally you miss the train. These are the 37 companies. You can see the names with a global turnover of about put together 500 billion euros and with a global spend of over 300 billion euros. This slide I specifically put in the slides here because I believe there were some misconceptions related to TFS, because TFS is not something which is an Indian consortium, right? And there is something people spoke about, responsible care, and I believe there was some kind of ambiguities in the mind that, responsible care and TFS, they are kind of competitors, but that's not the case. You can see on the slide, I think they share a very common kind of goal, and I specifically wanted to highlight this so that tomorrow if you get a request from any of your customers based in Europe or in the US to, go for EcoVadis assessments or TFS audits, you should not, say that, no, that's not something, and, you're already part of responsible care, for example. Idea is also to see how some of the potential players from India, Indian chemical industry, they can also become, let's say, members of TFS, initiative. Not only, you don't only then look for the assessments or the audits, but also you play a very key role in terms of what is required for the industry then. I also wanted to give you a brief idea about the India structure because we started this India chapter in 2016. I recently joined this. As you can see here, India chapter is headed by Rajiv Gaur, who is a global head of procurement for Lanxess, based in Mumbai. And then we have 5 work streams, as you can see on the top right-hand corner. I am heading the work stream number 5, which is focused more on greenhouse gas emissions, predominantly on scope 3. And all these 16 companies in India, they are the members again. But there's no local or Indian company as of now who is part of TFS initiative. And I would request each one of you, those who consider themselves worthy of becoming part of this, they should, So, when we talk about PCF, I think on some of the occasions this term was used today, and I hope that most of you are aware of this term PCF. This is product carbon footprint, and what critical role this is going to play in future for each one of you, being, let's say the majority of the supplier base for most of the Western countries, let's say. So I think in some of the cosmetics, maybe some of the ladies would know that it is already started appearing now, some kind of information which talks about the complete transparency, like, how much carbon footprint this particular product is associated with. And so basically, during the entire life cycle of each product, how much carbon emissions are created, that is something which is then quantified in terms of product carbon footprint. As you can see in the slide, there are various stages, and at each stage, right from, let's say, manufacturing, and then go upstream up to the, the first supplier, for example, or maybe the mine or the raw material, throughout the supply chain, you see emissions getting added at each stage. And at the end of the day, when the final product is ready for the end use, you should be able to kind of see and compare, which product is having what value of product carbon footprint, and based on that, then you can decide which product you want to buy. And then that way you can then actually affect or, kind of influence this entire carbon emission, kind of system which is there. Now this is a challenge because, as most of you heard during the day, this is predominantly Scope 3 emissions, and measuring Scope 3 emissions is not an easy task. There's so many different players involved, multiple layers are there, and I think that really makes it very, very challenging. And earlier, as I said, for Merck, for example, if I source something from India, for me, my Scope 3 emissions are basically your Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, right? So for you, this is very critical to kind of, identify and measure your Scope 1 and 2 emissions. And similarly, for you to be kind of, compliant with Scope 1, 2, and 3, you also need to know the emissions of your suppliers. And this is a kind of cascading, it's a chain reaction. So unless you reach the final or the origin of the product, the raw material basically, you can't really say that, yeah, you're free of the emissions. And also some of the speakers said that, the chemical industry, of course, globally, they contribute close to about 7% emissions. And out of that, 77% emissions constitute Scope 3 emissions. So you can understand how critical it would be to kind of measure and assess these Scope 3 emissions. So as I said, the solution is something which TFS worked together. They put together some guidelines which will help the industry, the chemical industry, in terms of identifying and then calculating the product carbon footprint. You might wonder that, do we have something already in place? Yes, there was something like greenhouse gas protocol, which also kind of gives you an idea about how to calculate it, but that's something which is not focused on any particular sector. Those guidelines are quite generic, and they may not really help you to kind of very accurately calculate your emissions. And that's why TFS, using various experts from the industry, various government agencies, NGOs, various people came together, they collaborated together, and then they kind of, tailored this solution which suits to the requirements of the chemical industry specifically. And this is something which is available to all. It's not something which is like, you need to be a member of TFS or something. This is available to all. I'll show you where you can actually download those guidelines and see how you can make use of them. As I said, this is a kind of quite collaborative kind of approach which we adopted here. And now those guidelines are available. Here you can see. Those guidelines are available. You can download them and then see for yourself. And as I said, there are 5 work streams. I specifically represent work stream number 5, which is focused on Scope 3 emissions. And then within that also we had 5 chapters. 1 to 4 are not really related to Scope 3 emissions, so that's why we are not really talking about it. But chapter 5 is fully dedicated to these guidelines. You can download and see for yourself. You can also see some of the agencies like World Business Council for Sustainability Development. They are also part of this, and they have kind of vetted and ratified these guidelines. They are also compliant with ISO guidelines, so you don't really need to kind of worry about how many times different guidelines you'll follow. So if you follow these guidelines, you don't really need to follow other kind of guidelines for that. You also saw this slide earlier in a different form, of course, when we spoke about cradle-to-gate approach. So there are two major approaches which are adopted mostly. One is cradle-to-gate and the other one is cradle-to-grave. So cradle-to-grave is something which covers the entire life cycle, of course, but cradle-to-gate is something which is from, let's say, upstream suppliers to our manufacturing operations. So once the product is ready, then we don't really talk about downstream, which is because of the supplier, which is because of the customers, let's say. So this particular guidelines, this is applicable only to, cradle-to-gate kind of setup and not to cradle-to-grave. And we don't even think of kind of, developing it further at the moment, because although, as all of you know, I think for all practical purposes, even for creation of your, P&L or whatever, I think everything ends at your manufacturing and not beyond that. You don't really care how your customers are actually, taking that. So that's why we want to limit it only to cradle-to-gate kind of approach. As I said, this is a kind of, this is more like a decision tree, which will help you to take a decision, how you can make use of these guidelines. This is a bit of a technical stuff, and I don't think it'll make any sense to kind of talk about this. Some of the speakers also spoke about carbon capturing methods here earlier. I think Savik spoke about that, right? So I will skip this slide here then. And then another thing, which is something work in progress right now, is data sharing solution. This is we are already kind of running a pilot right now, and hopefully by next year this solution should be available. And this then can something like TFS, for example. When I was talking about TFS, so if you get an EcoBodies assessment done for all member companies, they can share or they can see the same results, and you don't really need to kind of, honor 10 different requests for that. So something similar will happen here. So once you have this tool available, I think once you have your product carbon footprint ready, you share this here. You don't really need to kind of, adopt different methods how to share this. So this is still work in progress, so hopefully by next year we'll see something there. And I don't know how we are doing on the time, because then I could also show 3 slides, which are the benefits for TFS members, if you want. How are we doing on the time? Okay. So I just quickly show you what are the benefits of being a TFS member. There are 3 different stakeholders, as you can see: procurement, supplier community, and sales and CSR people. For procurement, these are the benefits. Everything is standardized, simplified. There's a accountability and responsibility and sharing. For the supplier community, as I said, you don't really need to kind of use your resources multiple times, so that really improves your efficiency, and also creates business opportunities for you. And finally, for the sales force or for the CSR people, it kind of makes you more compliant, and that way really you have an edge over others. Thank you very much.